This is Compendium, a podcast about communication and communication research. This podcast is produced in conjunction with the Department of Communication at the University of Connecticut. Here now are the hosts of Compendium, Steve Stefano and Christine Gilbert.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Compendium. I am, as always, Steve Stefano, along with my new co-host, Christine Gilbert. Hi, Christine.
Hi, Steve. Hi, everyone.
So today we're going to talk about crisis and risk, two things that we often deal with but don't think about too much before they happen. But an interesting component of that, I think, is how we communicate in those moments and how that communication can save lives.
And Dr. Kenneth Lachlan is also the department head here in the Department of Communication, so we'll get a little bit into his daily life and how his research informs what he does as the department head.
Absolutely. So let's get on with it. As we mentioned already, our guest today is Dr. Ken Lachlan. Our guest today is a professor and head of the Department of Communication. He's also a researcher on crisis and risk. Please welcome Dr. Kenneth Lachlan to the podcast.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so we're going to start with some way back stuff. So,
Sure.
Where were you born?
Where was I born? I was born in Norwalk, Connecticut in 1975.
So you're a local.
I'm kind of local. Yeah, I'm sort of local.
Okay.
Lived in many places between here and there, and I find myself back in the beautiful Nutmeg State, working here at the University of Connecticut. So it's been a long, circuitous journey, but I'm very happy to be home.
I'd say life has a way of completing that circle sometimes.
It does sometimes.
Okay, so first time you're in school and something happens or someone says something and you say, communication? When was that?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I started off as a business major. I was an undergraduate at Wake Forest in North Carolina. And two of the required courses for the business degree at Wake at the time were public speaking and interpersonal communication. Okay, so I did okay in accounting and econ. I did fairly well, but there was something about the human factors component, especially at the time in interpersonal, that really appealed to me. And as is often the case, I had a really, really good professor who was really energetic about the material. Really forthcoming and really willing to work with students. His name was Alan Loudon. He was the debate director at Wake at the time and then later became my academic advisor. And Alan introduced himself to me after class and we started talking about work, and that led to a number of other things, including later on an undergraduate research assistantship with Randy Rogan, who's another faculty member at Wake Forest. And that was sort of the beginning of my love of research and of the more the human factors side of things as opposed to the business side of things. I was also, at the time, working in public radio. My freshman year in college, I began working as a production engineer and on-air host at the NPR station in Winston-Salem. And I was also working pro bono for the campus radio station in a separate capacity just to kind of make ends meet. I was making like minimum wage, like $4.25 an hour or something in 1993, which was I'm not sure how I survived exactly, but the pieces all kind of came together. I mean, I liked what I was doing work wise. I was really interested in the material, and it just sang to me. It was way more appealing than what I had been doing at that point, and it became really interesting and really riveting, and I'm still doing it.
Was there a moment somewhere in that progression where you said, this is it, like I'm going to go become a faculty member, a professor in communication, this is what I want to do?
That came later.
Yeah.
I'll be honest. Even on into my master's program, I was still debating whether or not I wanted to take the academic path or whether I wanted to explore marketing research. And I interviewed for a job at AC Nielsen in Cincinnati when I was coming out of my graduate program that I ended up not getting, unfortunately. But right until the very end, I was on the fence about the academic versus the professional route. And in the end, once again, in my master's program at Bowling Green in Ohio, I had a really good faculty member that I worked with who involved me in projects and sort of introduced me to the larger academic world and publishing and conference life, sort of a step beyond what I'd experienced as an undergraduate. And her name was Melissa Spirac. She's now the department head at, I want to say Wright State in Dayton. And in working with Melissa, I really sort of realized like, oh, this is cool. And she was also doing stuff that was, I don't know, a little more similar maybe to what I'm doing now, that was very media heavy and very sort of media psychology heavy. And I really liked her work and working with her. And she sort of mentored me that next step towards, okay, here's something that maybe you are naturally kind of proficient at.
So we already, it sounds like you went to Wake Forest as an undergrad.
Yep.
Bowling Green as a master's. And here in the department, we know that you are an alum of the Michigan State.
The Michigan
Tell us a
State
little bit
University.
about that progression, what that was like.
Sure. By that stage in the game, I was pretty confident I was going to graduate school. And I'm very quantitatively inclined. I mean, I have a lot of respect for different methodologies and ways of approaching communication, but the questions that I ask, or that I tend to ask, lend themselves better to quantitative inquiry, which is kind of how I landed where I landed. And for me, it was a choice between Michigan State and Cal Santa Barbara. We also have a number of faculty here that went to UCSB. And my undergraduate mentor that I mentioned, Randy Rogan, Randy was an MSU alum. And I had a lot of respect for his work and for his methodological abilities. And that kind of pushed me towards Michigan State. I also did have this moment of clarity where I visited UCSB. And if you've ever been to Isla Vista, California, it's located in between the ocean and the mountains. And I had this moment walking around Santa Barbara where I said to myself, there is literally no way that I should go to graduate school here. Like I should go somewhere that's cold and full of freezing rain. That way I'll stay inside and read journal articles. I'm only half kidding. I mean, given where I was when I was, in my early 20s, I was like, yeah, I should probably not move to California right now. I'm going to go to a top program in a place that will encourage me to not surf all day. So that was how I found myself at Michigan State. Great program, great training. I worked with, my advisor was Ron Tamburini, who's the former editor of Media Psychology. And I was funded for a while through the office of the late Bradley S. Greenberg, who's one of the most published people in the history of the field. Brad had a couple of grants at the time, one from the Rudd Foundation, which is now ironically based here, and another from, I want to say, the Pew Charitable Trust. And that paid for, that was where I was funded. I was funded through Brad's grants. So I got great, one-on-one mentorship from Ron, and also this really cool kind of business-like experience from Brad that was really the beginning of my thinking about organizations and structures and functions. Brad was he's a former journalist and former Army too, who had really an innate understanding of how organizations work and how to manage research teams, how to manage departments. And he was very influential on me in that way. And
so moving through, it sounds like the research has always been something that you're super passionate about. That's never been an issue in terms of interest. Mm-hmm. Was the progression towards eventually deciding, yes, I do want to stay in academia, was that as linear a path as the research was for you, or were there other things that kind of caught your interest and maybe made you question whether or not you wanted to be a professor?
There have been moments where I've thought about the applicability of my research in other contexts. I mean, it's certainly crossed my mind. I love my job and I love what I do, and I get to manage and work with great people. But there have been times earlier in my career where I thought that maybe a government job or a position with a contract research organization like RAND or WestStat might open other opportunities for me, or be an interesting way to see my research make a real tangible difference in policy analysis and in the implementation of different public or social policies. But at the end of the day, I find myself here. I like working with students. I picked up my entire life and moved it from Boston to Connecticut so I could work with graduate students, because I hadn't done that yet. I like working with creative people who have really interesting ideas. I like pursuing my own agenda. I mean, one of the great things about this business is that I get to do research on things that I think are important and have real social value, and I get to make that call. I'm not working for a manager or an immediate supervisor who's leaning over me saying, why are you investigating these questions? Why are you sending this to this journal? Why are you have a lot of creative freedom in this business that you don't have in other lines of work. And that's something that I really value. I mean, the creative control and the stability is really, really important to me. And that's why I'm still here. I really enjoy what I do. And I really enjoy working with students, both graduate and undergraduate students.
I mean, I think that it's funny, we hear that a lot from faculty when you ask them about the possibilities and the potentials. And I've spoke with many faculty who've had moments or opportunities and they stare at them long and hard. But they come back to this because of the freedom afforded in the day-to-day operations of the job. And I think that for a lot of people, they assume that there's a very linear process for professors. They start, they're committed to it, they're going to do it, it's the only thing they're going to do, and they don't consider any other option than being buried in books all day. And it's very cliche and it's very trite. But for many faculty, this experience is kind of a fluid process where you find that your heart tells you where to go more so than the practicality of the different decisions that are present and the options that are available to you.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if you want to make a ton of money and live in a major city, do something else.
This is not us.
This might not be the career track for you. But the stability and the creativity and being able to work with people and learn from people and to constantly be engaged in that process of thinking and learning and exploring and being able to pursue the things that you find valuable and important, that's really, that's what keeps you coming back. Absolutely.
So you started your career doing video games and violence, and you end up moving into crisis and risk, and you've become one of the top scholars in that area.
Yeah.
So
thanks. I shouldn't say yes. I should say thanks.
You can say yes.
Both are true.
What was the transition like to go from such a one specific area to this, and what keeps you there?
It's the darndest thing. I tell my graduate students, like, don't be afraid of wild left turns. I call this my warm, dry apartment in Brighton, Massachusetts story. So I'm sitting in my warm, dry apartment in Brighton, Massachusetts while Katrina's moving in. And I have friends who lived just outside New Orleans in Kenner, and I had been kind of texting back and forth with them, and they were more or less okay. But I remember watching Katrina roll in, and I'm sitting there in my warm, dry apartment, watching weather.com, and I'm watching this thing roll in. And it looks really scary and devastating, and I know enough about social injustice to know that, the Corps of Engineers have been asking for funding to, mitigate the levees there for decades, and it hadn't happened, and this was potentially very, very bad. They had been warding against direct strike by a Cat 3 or higher for decades. And we all saw what happened next. I started asking myself questions about, like, well, what happened? What information do people have access to? Why were resources not distributed across different communities of different socioeconomic status? What steps did people take or not take to insulate themselves against this threat? What could have been done different from a messaging standpoint that could have helped people? And in some instances it could have helped, in other instances it would not have mattered, because if you have no transportation or no way out, it doesn't matter, right? So I started thinking about this, and I began thinking about kind of what I was studying and where my research interests lay. And the video game research is very admirable, and I have a lot of respect for the scholars who do work in that area, but it occurred to me that I was chasing, first of all, very, very small effects, right, in an area of research that is really politicized, and that I was chasing, how can I put this, negative data. I was chasing incidental effects, right? So no one designs a video game saying, I'm going to design the game that creates the most mass murderers amongst my audience. Like, no one designs a game thinking that. And instead of chasing unintended effects, I started asking myself, well, maybe I can chase intended effects and look at how we can help people make better decisions that, help save life and property. And I started thinking that maybe there was some work that, I could do that would have some, greater and more immediate social value or impact on policy. Another thing, too, is at the time, not many people were doing crisis and risk research that came from a quantitative media effects type angle. And a couple of my colleagues and I got together and started batting ideas around and said, well, why aren't we? Like, we're looking at messages, and we're looking at the rhetoric of messaging, and we're looking at, organizational, cycles and structural models, but we're not looking at how people react from a psychological standpoint. Why aren't we? And, a simple conversation one night over a conference paper turned into what I've been doing for the last 15 years.
That's a really fun story in a really bleak incident. And it shows that there are opportunities that cut across disciplines, and that cut across social problems, political problems, environmental problems related to a lot of the areas that we work in communication, especially when it comes to crisis and risk, I also find, and we'll talk a little bit about your role as chair of this department in a little bit, but I think it's interesting because when you look at things from a research perspective, you can either be a reactive researcher where you're saying, well, what happened here? Or you can be an active researcher where you say, how can we change this going forward? And a lot of leaders talk about acting, not reacting. And so there's an interesting cross-section there that cuts across a couple different things that you're doing on a regular basis.
I hadn't thought of it until just now, but you make a good point.
So, all right, so let's zoom out a little bit on crisis communication.
All right.
And regardless, if it's a flood, a hurricane, a fire, whatever it may be, is there something that you have learned that might be a nice, we'll call it a cocktail party takeaway, something that in like a sentence or two or a paragraph that you would say across crises you've noticed or observed or could be helpful?
Evaluate sources judiciously. If I could put it in, is that 3 words? There's a lot of misinformation that floats around, particularly in social media. Okay. So I think social media users are getting better at this, and I'll spare you the details, but I have data supporting that notion. And people are more apt to go to and also to retweet or to serial transmit content that comes from sources that are somewhat reliable, that they likely recognize as being reliable through their own exposure or their own knowledge or their own source credibility. But I think what we have with crisis and risk is the same thing that we have with any media effects phenomenon, in that we have this is not a cocktail party answer at all, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
In that we have this media literacy issue, right, of being able to discern fact from fiction and truth from rumor or innuendo, and to understand what are reliable sources that are providing actionable information and what are not. And that cuts across everything. And I think people are getting better at knowing where to look. I think emergency management agencies have a lot to learn about how to maximize the potential of their media interventions, especially when it comes to newer technologies. But I guess if I were to give you a takeaway, it would be, scrutinize sources under those conditions like you would any other time. Oftentimes under great duress, like any answer will do, right? You're looking for something to relieve the anxiety or the insecurity of like these really equivocal situations. Even in that moment, scrutinize the content that you're receiving, if at all possible.
Yeah, same rules apply. I think sometimes with social media, certainly it becomes, the information is immediate, so I think I'll trust it more, which isn't necessarily, can have very detrimental consequences.
Right. Yeah.
So something I'd like to talk about that you mentioned about Hurricane Katrina with the warm story in Brighton.
Yeah.
First, a fair number of our listeners don't remember Hurricane Katrina, so maybe if you could give a little bit, you did a nice job already talking about, New Orleans was kind of prime for this. They had been essentially waiting, or there hadn't been a hurricane of this magnitude in a while, and just the perfect storm. And then also talk a little bit about, I think one thing that's interesting that we try to introduce Communication 1000 students to is that, communication researchers go out. They're not just in the lab in a white coat. They're not just on their computers reading books, but they're literally in the megadome collecting surveys. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and that whole experience. Yeah, I was able to dispatch my team down to here's what happened. So for those of you who are too young to remember, Katrina approached the coast of New Orleans as a Category 3. It was only Cat 1 when it made landfall. It actually lost quite a bit of wind speed as it approached, but the issue at hand was the storm surge and the amount of water from the Gulf Coast that was kicked up. Much of the city of New Orleans lies below sea level, okay, and is protected by a series of dams and levees that had not been properly reinforced for decades. The Ninth Ward in particular lies several feet below sea level, and you can almost gauge the property values in the city of New Orleans by how far above or below sea level they are. It's the reason Bourbon Street is where it is, because it's the highest ground in the city and has been for the last 400 years. That's why they built it there. And the Ninth Ward, the poorest part of the city, is sitting at the lowest elevation. So you can imagine what communities were going to be most adversely affected by this, right? So the people who most need the help are the ones who are also in the worst possible place to be, right? Great. So the levees failed. Several thousand people were evacuated, many of whom found themselves in the Astrodome in Houston. And I happen to have a colleague who worked at Prairie View A&M in Texas at the time. And she and a couple of my other team members were able to get access to the Astrodome and go in there and collect data. Like, and this is the mid 2000s, so we're not talking about tablets. We're talking about walking into the Astrodome with 2 bankers' boxes full of paper surveys.
Oh boy.
Yeah, and the most incredible thing with the whole story, I mean, we had a protocol that was ready to go. That was sort of like a general use protocol, so we could just get in the field when we had to. But the amazing thing is that nobody stopped them. Like they walked right.
Just walked into
They
no
just walked
questions.
into the
Who are
Astrodome.
you?
Just walk right in. I mean, like 4 people carrying big bankers' boxes full of surveys, just 1,000 of them, just cruised right in. We also collected from relief centers on Cape Cod and in Indiana and Kentucky, and I was on a couple of those. But basically, we just walked up to people who were waiting in line for relief packages and said, we're trying to help. We're trying to find out what happened. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were watching? And people were so bored from waiting in lines that were hours long for relief packages that they were like, well, if that kills 20 minutes, sure. And then eventually what happened was somebody mentioned to Jennifer, they were like, okay, do you mind, we've been in line for a long time. I could sure use, like a candy bar or something. So she and her team ran down to a store about a couple miles away and bought like a pallet of water and like several boxes of Snickers bars and brought them back, and it became water and a Snickers bar for your survey. And then the data collection was on at that point. Then everyone's like, okay, you're going to take up, this will kill 20 minutes of my time, and also I'm starving. So thank you for the Snickers bar and the water. I'm happy to fill your survey out. So 960 something surveys later, we had data from people who had to be evacuated regarding what information they had, what resources were available to them, how they responded initially to the warnings and risk messages they received, their level of concern, whether they were actually able to act upon the information they received. And very often it was the case where they had good information, they just didn't have the resources, economically or otherwise, to be able to get out. And that was kind of one of several stories that we learned from Katrina. So we do quite a bit of field research. I have people in the field right now in Northern California. Christine, you're part of this.
Yes,
that
yes.
are collecting data on the wildfires, like social media use before the Camp Fire in Northern California that took place back in December. That's a fast-moving event, so I'm looking to see if social media maybe played a bigger role in people's dependencies and where they went for information, because by the time the news catches it, the fire might be taking your house. So does someone tweet a picture and to get out, et cetera, and so on. So yeah, we get in the field pretty often, especially in instances such as these where we're examining what's happening in the physical environment. The latest, and I think this is really interesting, there's a team out at the University of Washington. They're actually in the engineering department, and I do some review work for them, who are looking at geotagging these types of responses and seeing if media dependencies and mitigation vary by terrain, by the geographic locale within where a given crisis or disaster takes place. They're soil scientists by training, and they're doing this really interesting like social science work on geotagging survey responses. So yeah, there is all of this work that we often do in the field that kind of goes unnoticed. We're not sticking our nose in books. We're out interacting with people who hopefully serve to benefit from the work that we're doing.
And I think this ties in a number of things. One is being a reactive researcher and essentially saying California wildfires or Hurricane Katrina have happened. What are things that we can essentially learn from this and apply in the future? And I know you've had multiple research studies that have come out about Hurricane Katrina that have essentially become pillars in the field, for better or for worse, and I think for better.
Well, thanks.
And then the other element you talk about too is this interdisciplinary nature where researchers from across all disciplines, right? We need engineers and we need social scientists and we need soil scientists to all work together.
Yep.
So you did mention the California Wildfires project that we're working on currently, hoping to get that data back. Is there anything else in particular you're thinking, maybe pipe dream or 10, 15 years down the line, about research you'd love to work on?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, I think, the geotagging piece is definitely going to be important for us going forward. I think we're going to learn more about the intersection of geotagging and opinion leadership too, like something
on social media.
Yeah, in social media in particular. Yeah. One thing that I see the field moving more towards is the analysis of large volumes of data, and social media data, which exists in situ. It's out there and it's public domain, and you can just harvest it and make inferences about human behavior based on I mean, Jen Zhu and I just worked on a paper where Jen pulled down 2.5 million tweets using, because she's a very good R programmer, and we looked at, there were a Twitter behavior regarding Hurricane Irma, and it's painting with a very, very broad brush, but you can make some inferences about human behavior just by observing what's happening in the environment, just by tackling social media data. Looking at network analyses and opinion leadership and those metrics and how that emerges in this context. So I don't know, I think, eventually connecting the dots, network analysis. I think connecting the dots about how opinion leadership forms under those circumstances by looking at, dozens and dozens and dozens of different eventualities and what the consistencies are across those events, or if there are consistencies, to figure out who emerges as being an important voice and who has influence in that environment, I think in the long term is where I would like to see things going in the next 10 or 15 years. That's a really abstract answer, but that's kind of what I envision moving towards. Yeah.
Well, I think that sometimes there's a fluidity when we think ahead. Every now and then you meet a researcher who says, nope, 3 years from now we'll be doing this, and 5 years we'll be doing this. But for the most part, we're kind of open, and I think that open-mindedness is important to what we do and the inquiry that we make. Speaking of having to be open-minded, you also work as the head of this department, the Department of Communication. So you oversee, just for those that may not be fully aware, essentially our entire operation on a day-to-day basis. You've also worked in a similar capacity at a different school at UMass Boston in the past. So what I'm curious about is, what do you learn about the field of communication from working in an administrative role overseeing a department that maybe you wouldn't have learned or noticed otherwise? What things do you see from your position that are different than the position of a faculty member or a graduate student or even a student?
I think you see the bigger picture. It kind of gets back to Christine's question about interdisciplinarity. I have far more exposure to people who work in other disciplines than I ever had when I was a primarily teaching and research faculty member. And I have the opportunity to kind of see where these chances for collaboration exist and kind of what the norms and protocols are in other disciplines and fields. And I find myself having conversations, good, bad, and other, that I never thought I would have to have. Because when you're a faculty member, you just assume, oh yeah, well, it's communication, and we go to this conference at this time of year, and this conference at this time of year, and recruiting works this way, and graduate stipends work this way, and the grant pressure is this much, and we hire on this timeline, and you discover very quickly that across the board, there is so much variability from field to field and from discipline to discipline in terms of what the norms and expectations are, whether it's for tenure, whether it's for public engagement, whether it's for grant writing. There are so many things across different fields and disciplines and subdisciplines that are really highly variable. And you also find that they're variable from institution to institution. Mm-hmm. So this is the third institution that I've worked at as a faculty member. And each one of them had things they did well and had things that they could improve upon. And they were different things. So you learn a lot about the structure of an institution too, and how those mechanical and organizational pieces work that you wouldn't have exposure to. I mean, the great thing about being a faculty member is that you are free to devote yourself to your teaching and your research and not think about anything else. And the terrible thing about being a faculty member is that you are free to teach and do your research and not think about anything else. It's really opened my eyes to how kind of diverse and how wide this business is in terms of interest and the norms and protocols, the way people do things, and what the expectation, and even what people get out of it, even like what people's motivations are for wanting to do this for a living, are quite variable. So I'm really grateful for having had the exposure to other disciplines and other faculty that I would not have had I been permanently siloed in one department at one university, for example.
So in teaching COM 1000, we spend a lot of time talking to students from all over the university and trying to situate communication within the broader academy and try to talk about sort of our role and how our role intersects with all the other things they might or might not be doing or might decide to do later at the institution. And we notice it's gotten increasingly easier, but I think it's interesting from the vantage point of a department head interacting with the entire institution and the entire academy. It's undoubtedly observable to see all the differences, but all the room for maybe collaboration or overlap or similar goals, and then even different goals that could be achieved in similar ways depending on how resources are pooled. So it must be interesting to see it from that vantage point as well, because I think it speaks similarly to the same thing we're saying in our lecture when we say, hey, even if you're in a STEM field, or even if you're over here, even if you're in this different area, trust me, what we're talking about here overlaps with what you're doing there.
Yeah. One of the things that has been a bit of a challenge in the interdisciplinary projects that I have launched or tried to launch over the years is that we often don't speak the same language in terms of technical terminology or nomenclature. So I've had meetings with, let's say, an anthropologist or a sociologist, and we're talking about the same thing, but we're using different technical language to get at the same issue, and it almost takes an extensive conversation before you have that aha moment where you go, oh, you call X Y and I call Y X. So those types of terminological issues often trip us up, but then once we get past them, we find that we have common problems that we're trying to solve, and we're coming at them from different angles. So it's been really interesting in that sense. I do some review work too for the National Science Foundation. They fly me down there twice a year to review grant proposals, and increasingly government funding agencies are recognizing the importance of coming at these social problems from a number of different angles and a number of different disciplinary lenses. So you'll have engineers, communication scientists, and sociologists, maybe even like an economist, for example, working on the same project and attacking it from different sides and different angles in order to have the most robust sort of perspective on the social problem in question. So yeah, it's been really interesting to see that kind of interdisciplinarity, and I think academe on the whole is heading in that direction of becoming far less siloed than it has been historically. And I think that's good. I think that's good for generating innovation.
Okay, so we're winding down with a couple final questions here. One thing we've asked just about everybody we've had on as a guest is, if you had one 50-minute lecture in front of COM 1000 or our Intro to Communication course, what would you lecture about and why?
I think I would give a presentation on risk communication and how to interpret and think about risk messages. One of the things that I talk about a lot in my own classwork is that people, and I mean, all of us, not me, myself included, we don't tend to be very good statistical thinkers when it comes to risk. Christine's heard this. That we often underestimate risks that are very real and very apparent and that pose real dangers to us. And we often overestimate risks that really aren't likely to adversely affect anyone. And understanding kind of risk information and how to interpret it and how to distinguish between what is there to frighten you that is actually not all that important and the things you don't know about that you ought to, and how to derive that information from your news media and from a variety of different sources. Something revolving around that, but how to use media and information to evaluate risk and to protect yourself, in terms of your health or your property or your life. Something along those lines, I think, would be something that I would want to do. We have this sort of joke about there are risks that are real that fail to upset people, and risks that aren't that do. And being able to draw that distinction, I think, is an important one. So anything that I could do to sort of help people critically evaluate the risk information that they're receiving, that would be where I would step in 1000. Cool.
And I think the practicality of that is, can you hold that for the department as well? As a graduate student, I would love that information on a regular basis, part of orientation.
Yeah, we'll slide that in on day one of orientation.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome to Connecticut. Let's just remind you that you will not fall out of an airplane.
That's right. Yeah, that's highly unlikely, but be careful driving.
Yeah. So the last question here is kind of in general. You can think about communication or essentially life as a student, but any piece of advice that you have for our students, maybe about coursework or about their path in academia, that you'd want to give to them?
Keep your options open. When I was 18 years old, I thought I had everything figured out. I was going to be a finance major. I was going to go to investment banking. I was going to work somewhere that wasn't Norwalk, like Stanford.
Exactly.
Keep your options open. Like you will encounter things that you will find intellectually interesting and challenging and rewarding. You may find yourself making decisions that deviate greatly from what you thought you were going to be doing. When you take those chances and those chances pan out, those are the best moments. Those are absolutely the best and most gratifying moments, both academically and professionally. Don't be afraid of left turns. sometimes those are the best ones.
I love that. And I think more than anything, listening to the kind of the people that we've interviewed here, it sounds like that has been the progression about finding academia, not as a last resort or not as a first resort, but as somewhere along the middle of finding this career path. I just want to thank you again, Dr. Kenneth Lachlan, department head here at the University of Connecticut. So I want to thank Professor Stefano, my co-host, and thank the audience for listening.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks,
Ken.
Ken.
Thanks.
The views expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and their guests. They do not reflect the views of the University of Connecticut or the UConn Department of Communication.